All right. So since we were having the conversation anyways, I'll just do things a little bit out of order here. So we've been doing some base conversion stuff, right? Converting binary to decimal, and from some base to some base, or from some base to decimal, regardless of what that starting base is. And we're going to come back and we're going to talk about. Let's do it right here. I'll just throw a slide in. Decimal to base. So we're going to have to talk about that direction of things. But as we go, remember we're in the series right now where we're kind of going from C to C++. I'll fill this in a little bit more just so you can see where we're going. Here's Java. So Java came from C++, and we'll talk about what was wrong with C++ and why Java was an improvement there. And then right around here is when we have the discussion between some competitors. So when we go, this is where C# comes in. And then at the same time, we also have over here Objective-C. So when we made the jump from C to C++, so an object-oriented programming language, at that exact same time, we have the war between Microsoft and Apple, right? So those two couldn't agree. So you have Microsoft that effectively adopted C++. You have Apple that effectively adopted Objective-C. So we're going to have that discussion, but we also, in line with that, we have the discussion between Apple and Google, talking about their operating system. So let's talk about that now, since the question came up. I'll insert it here. And this goes back to, so let's just talk about iPhone versus Android. All right, so this goes back to a discussion we probably had the first week of class, kind of talking about people are so quick to demonize Microsoft. They think Microsoft makes, they steal stuff, blah, blah, but all the big companies do it. It's just the American way, right? If you're, think about from Microsoft's perspective, and Apple will do the same thing. Just maybe they make less news. But if you're some kid who writes some great piece of software that Microsoft wants, Microsoft's path of least resistance is to steal the software, get sued by you, settle outside of court, and move on with life, as opposed to trying to write it themselves, then see who gets the patent first, or sit there and negotiate with you and how much you want to sell it for. If you're some kid who wrote this stuff and then Microsoft says, okay, you're suing us, but we'll give you $5 million to go away. Well, first of all, you might put on pants. Well, and then you'll take the $5 million and move on with life. Even if that thing could have turned, even if Microsoft turns it into more than a $5 million product, you probably didn't have the resources to do that. Okay, so it's kind of we look at these big companies and we kind of perceive that they're all evil, and maybe we could say to some extent they are, but that's the path of least resistance to acquire software. Get sued, pay them outside of court, and move on with life. So kind of with that in mind, let's go back to the early days of iPhone versus Android. Which came first? Between these two. It was not. It was iPhone. Okay, so and really what we're talking about here is this isn't even an accurate comparison, because we're not talking about iPhone versus Android. We're talking about iOS versus Android. These are the operating systems that live on them. So iOS is the operating system that lives on iPhone and iPads. Android is the operating system that lives on a zillion different phones, regardless of who makes them. So Apple makes all of the phones and all the tablets that iOS runs on, where Android is an operating system created by Google that runs on a zillion different pieces of hardware that they didn't have much to do with making, right? So iOS came first. So just quick, so we can get the room pitted against each other. How many of you are Android people in here? Okay, how many of our iPhone people? Pretty close to half and half. All right, good. So clearly the iOS people in here are going to say that, oh, iOS is better. And then the Android people are going to say Android is better. So let's kind of go. So iOS came first. Now, this is in the early days, so somebody mentioned BlackBerry, right? You also had the Palm OS before that. So the idea of a smartphone was already kind of a thing, but consumers were a smartphone back then wasn't so much what we view a smartphone as being today. The iPhone was really the catalyst that made everybody have a smartphone. Back when it was Palm and the Palm OS and BlackBerry, you basically was more of a business-centric type of tool. So iOS came out first, and Apple, coming out with these shiny things that people like and blah, 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 became very, very, very popular. So even the Android people in here could, accept that iPhone has become very popular, right? Apple's made $1 zillion off of it and stuff like that. Interesting thing, when iPhone first came out, there was only one carrier that you can get an iPhone on. Anybody know what carrier that was? It was AT&T. AT&T was the only carrier, but they were also Apple's second choice. Apple originally went to Verizon and wanted to convince them of, hey, we want you to be the sole carrier for the phone, but we want to make a deal with you. Apple's like, hey, we think we have something good. We think you want us on your network, so you're going to give us a really great deal so we can make $1 zillion off you, and you get to have the sole use of the phone. Well, Verizon turned them down. Probably something they regretted a couple of years later, but yeah, they did. So for several years, AT&T was the only platform that you can have an iPhone on. How many customers do you think AT&T gained from that? A lot. AT&T probably went from being somewhat of a secondary citizen to Verizon. Verizon was probably the big kid in mobile, where now AT&T is probably the bigger company, but let's call them the two top competitors. Most of the other competitors advertise themselves as being lower cost options, not necessarily better quality options. But iOS came out first, became very popular. So a year later or so, it's actually a little bit more than a year, Android comes out. And Android was rushed. So this guy was rushed to market. It was already a year behind Apple, over a year behind Apple. And already you had huge consumer adoption. So this wasn't just for business, this was for consumers. So Android was rushed. And Android is based on an operating system called Linux, which is a very, very good operating system. Now, when Android first came out, what were some of the complaints about Android? And this wasn't just when they first came out, for the first many years of Android. What were some of the telltale things that people would complain about Android? Somebody mentioned something about battery life, right? They would say Android had terrible battery life, where iOS, relatively speaking, had pretty good battery life. So let's call that the bad. Terrible battery life. What about the good? Supported multitasking. Support for Flash. All right, so what is Flash? When I say support for Flash, what am I talking about? The who? Yeah, Adobe Flash. So what kind of technology is that? Okay, so it's an interactive media within web pages, right? So like if you go to Yahoo Games, most of the games on there are Flash based, or were Flash based. They may have been upgraded to HTML5 now. So Android supported Flash. iOS, let's call this the bad, the good. Bad was no Flash, no multitasking. Good was good battery life, call it that. Then you have the design aspect of it, but that's up to, that's an individual's opinion. So really, you had some pieces here that were in direct competition with them, right? So iOS did not have Flash, did not have multitasking. This was perceived to be a bad thing. Whereas Android did have multitasking, it did have support for Flash. Now, when I say multitasking, what am I talking about? What couldn't you have done on an iPhone day one? Go ahead.
Couldn't you not have run 2 apps at the same time?
Yeah. So how many of you have a Pandora or something playing in the background on your phone? So if you wanted to listen to Pandora on iPhone for the first several years, that had to be the app that was on the screen. If you closed it, you want to check your email, Pandora is no longer playing. Okay? That sucks, right? You would say that's not a very good thing. Do you think if you're Android that you sit there on your commercials and you brag about the fact that that's not the case on Android, that Android has multitasking? Certainly. Android had great multitasking because Android was based on Linux. And Linux is an operating system that's been around for a long time, and it fully supports multitasking. But here's the issue. These two guys right here, multitasking and terrible battery life, are directly related to each other. Linux, being a really great desktop operating system, was designed for a computer that's plugged into the wall. Now all of a sudden you have a computer that's running off of a battery. So fine, multitasking works great, and your battery drains like crazy. Anybody know what the most popular app on the, or popular style of app on Android was for the first couple of years? For several years, actually. These were all apps that did the same thing.
Battery saver.
Okay, how do they save batteries? The goal was battery saving.
Clearing cache files or cache.
So they were apps that made it convenient to close other apps. Because what would happen is we pretty commonly, when you're on our phone, we just flip between apps, right? You don't think about that. Well, on iPhone, when you flip between an app, that app closed. Well, on Android, you flip between the app, it's in the background, still using processing power, still using memory, still using all sorts of system resources, still draining your battery, even if you're never going to come back to that. That make sense? So, sure, it supported it. So that sounds great to the consumer. And then obviously Google didn't brag about the crappy battery life, but those two were very related. So the popular apps on the App Store, and the App Store didn't even exist the first year. App Store didn't come out till the second year of iOS, first year of Android. But in any case, the most popular apps on the App Store were apps that kill other apps. She was kind of ridiculous, right? But it was by far the best. Now, how many of you are fans of Flash? All right, were you guys Android users as well? Both of you are Android users? So how many of you do you appreciate the fact that your phone supports Flash? Well, iPhone today does not support Flash. Do you like the fact that yours does?
No, I used to use Android.
Will you still use Android? Mm-hmm. Do you appreciate the fact that your phone supports Flash?
It was really nice, like a couple years ago, but now it seems like it's not as big of a deal nowadays.
Why would you say it's not as big of a deal?
Because like web pages are using different formats and stuff.
Yeah, they're all using HTML5 now, right? So in the early days, iOS supported HTML5. HTML5 was kind of the new proposed standard, whereas Flash was this old technology that people were just holding on to because they didn't want to have to redo websites. Now the funny thing is if you look back at a bunch of early Android commercials, they would all talk about how they supported Flash and how they had multitasking and Apple didn't. That means Apple looked crappy. Now what's funny is all of a sudden those commercials stopped playing, specifically about the Flash. Google never specifically announced this, but Google took Flash support out of Android around year 3. Android has not supported Flash in a long time. First of all, the mobile version of Flash, really the end user experience was crappy anyways. I mean, basically you were on a site, you could sort of kind of maybe use a Flash thing on that site, but probably not. It really wasn't designed for mobile. Now, the other thing, you could still test this today. because you could still get Flash. I mean, even though most web browsers now, when you download it, don't come stock with Flash. You have to download the plugin afterwards. If you're on a laptop, and let's say your laptop gets 7 hours of battery life. Just use that as an example. And now, would our perception be that if you go to like Yahoo Games, that's not a real complex site, right? That shouldn't really drastically kill your battery life. And I'm presuming Yahoo Games still uses Flash. It might not. So let's just pick a random site that still has some Flash on it. We would perceive that that's not really a major resource hog, right? If you had a laptop that gets 8 hours of battery life on average, and you unplug it from the wall, so it's running off just the battery, you go to a page that has Flash on it, that battery life probably drops to less than an hour. Flash destroys batteries. And the thing is, it's based on a very old technology. So it's not that Flash is innately crappy. Flash was old, and finally it became kind of antiquated. We needed something to replace it. Well, they were very popular, so they didn't want to have, a lot of websites had already integrated Flash into the site. They didn't want to spend the time or the money to replace it with something else. Apple pushed the HTML5 bandwagon, and it ended up taking over. So now the standard is HTML5, which can do a lot of the things that Flash can do, and then some. Okay, so behind the scenes, Android got rid of Flash and then just stopped bragging that they had it. Never actually told you they didn't. All right, so there was that. Now, at the same time, for a long time, Android would brag about having multitasking. Now, for the iPhone users today, can you have Pandora open, run it in the background, and have some other app open?
Yeah.
Does that mean iPhone today supports multitasking?
Seems like it. Yeah.
At least seems like it, right? It does support multitasking, but Apple designed multitasking specifically for mobile. So they said, okay, this isn't your traditional multitasking model. This isn't a computer that's just plugged into the wall that we presume is just going to keep running, right? That we have a battery now we have to preserve. So Apple said, look, an app by default does not get to play multitasking. If your app goes into the background, and if it made sense for that app to do something multitasking-wise, that app could register itself, a very small portion of itself, with the iOS, the operating system. For instance, there's like 8 things you can do in the background. One of those things is play music. So if your app is using Pandora, when it goes into the background, the whole app is basically shut down, except for maybe one function that is still streaming your songs and has your playlist and stuff, but it's doing it all through the operating system itself, not the app that's actually running. That make sense? So only a very small piece of that app is actually running in the background, which should take less system resources. Now, in that same period of time, batteries also kept getting better and better, and Apple came up with better ways of getting bigger batteries into their phone. Isn't that what happens every year? Every year, what happens? The screen gets bigger, the phone stays the same size, and the size of the battery goes up, and the battery life stays the same. Right?
That's why phones are always so big.
Well, it's not so much that most of what is here is battery. Yeah, you open this thing up, they put a battery in there, then they put components around it. Okay, if you were to open this guy up, you're going to see a lot of battery. The newest iPhones, I think at least iPhone 10, iPhone X, has 2 batteries. Because they need to create some separation so they can fit components in the middle. But in any case, a majority of what's in there is battery. Same thing's true here. So if you run a Mac laptop and you have a relatively new one, you notice that there's no screws to take the thing apart, right? Like everything is soldered to the board. There's no moving parts in this thing. If you had an older Mac laptop, the battery starts going crappy. You could pop the battery out in 2 seconds, go and buy, pay Apple $300 for a new battery, pop it in, you're good to go, right? No problem. Well, modern MacBooks don't have that. The battery is not replaceable by the end user. You can take it in, pay them a bunch of money, and they'll go in and perform the heart surgery to swap the battery for you. But what do they gain by doing that? So An end consumer might say, oh, well, that's just Apple's way of making sure we upgrade our batteries with their stuff rather than some third-party option. It's a money grab. Well, it might be some truth to that. But when you have a mechanism, when you push a button to have the battery pop out, that mechanism takes up some space, right? That's space that could be more battery. True story. If you see you can watch videos or something. You look at the inside of a MacBook. I mean, there's just battery everywhere. The whole thing is battery. And then because they don't even have if you have how many of you have a laptop that you can actually upgrade the memory in? Yeah, there's a little slot in the back. You take the screw out and pop some new chips in, move on with life, right? Can't do that on a Mac. That's space. They take the RAM, they solder it right to the board. Same thing with a hard drive. You can't swap out a hard drive on a MacBook. You open that thing up, the entire computer is that. It's all soldered together. There's no plugs.
So every new model will phone just more battery.
Well, phone, laptops, that's the same for any of these things. Every new laptop that comes out has more and more power, same battery life, right?
So the bottom line is space equals battery if they can fit it in.
That's it. So Apple's move was, hey, well, we're already in the world of expensive and aesthetically pleasing, so let's take all the little buttons and stuff out, take all the things on the inside, make it so that the end user can't upgrade their machine worth anything. That way they have to come by and buy again. But we'll give them more battery. And things will actually run, technically it runs faster because you don't have interfaces that connect things together. Your memory's soldered right to the motherboard. Fast. Make sense? Go ahead.
Your Mac Mini has replaceable parts.
Yeah, if you go to older Macs, they have replaceable parts. Mac Minis they haven't released a new Mac Mini in a long time. Yeah, so you go to an older iMac. Older iMacs have current iMacs you can replace the RAM in. But keep in mind, these are machines that are plugged into the wall, not running off a battery. But any of their laptops, any laptop from Apple in the last probably 5 years is a single piece of metal. With no moving parts. This machine has no moving parts in it. There's a decent chance if you took this and just slammed it across this, you would bend it, but you might not break it. It all depends on where you hit. There's nothing to break. Yeah, as long as you didn't rupture the battery, you're fine. No big deal. All right, so in any case, for a long time, Android would brag about that they had Flash, Apple did, and then they stopped bragging about that. And then it was just kind of a back and forth thing. So if you were an Android user, relatively early on, let's say, one thing you would, actually it didn't even have to be relatively early, let's just roll the clock back 2 or 3 years. One thing that Apple people would complain about is, oh, well, Android phone X has had this technology for, they just came out with that. Why didn't the newest, latest, greatest iPhone have that technology? You see that a lot with the Samsung Galaxies. Samsung Galaxy, which let's call that one of the flagship Android phones, they'll say, oh, well, here's this new technology that, OLED screens, let's say, is kind of the current thing. So it's a better quality screen on the thing. Better depth of color and better blacks and all that jazz. And then the iPhone X has that, but let's say last year's phone, iPhone 7, didn't have an OLED screen, but last year's Galaxy did. So then people would say, well, why does Samsung have that, but Apple didn't? What do you think?
Battery.
Well, is it because Apple couldn't have put an OLED screen on it?
Doesn't Samsung make the screens?
Samsung makes half the parts for the iPhone.
Yeah.
That just comes down to big companies having multiple divisions of themselves. Way back when I lived I taught at Western Illinois University in Macomb, Illinois, Verizon Online sued Verizon. They're two separate companies, even though they're the same parent company. Because it was for local high-speed internet when there wasn't really high-speed internet yet. We had a local provider that was providing DSL through Verizon. Verizon, actually, I'm going the wrong direction. It was Verizon that sued Verizon Online. Verizon charges an amount for a DSL circuit based on the number of customers a company has. Well, this little local ISP in Macomb, Illinois had, let's call it 300 customers, something like that. So obviously they were paying top dollar per circuit. Verizon Online could claim the zillions of customers they had around the country. So they could offer the same internet at a lot lower price. Well, so all of a sudden people in the community started getting things in their mailbox saying, oh, Verizon Online, you can get twice the speed you have now for a third the price. Who wouldn't want that, right? Well, but there was a special arrangement with the local internet service provider and Verizon that said, we will be the local provider for DSL, and another competitor can't come in and undercut us through Verizon itself. Well, now Verizon Online's coming in because the two sides aren't talking. Verizon Online and Verizon were not talking to each other. So Verizon ended up having to do a cease and desist to Verizon Online, saying you're not allowed to come into this this community because we have we have an arrangement with them already. And then the price for the local ISPs dropped to the same price Verizon Online could charge as a secondary thing. The point there is big companies have multiple divisions, and a lot of times they don't know what the sides are doing, or they don't care. They're actually run as separate companies. So yeah, I mean, a bunch of the parts in the iPhone are made by Samsung. Then Apple comes out and they say, well, they make their own silicon. So the chips in the iPhones are the A9, A10, A11 chip. Current one's the Bionic, it was A11 Bionic chip. Apple claims that, we make our own processors, right? Well, is that Apple making those processors? Sure it is. The company that Apple bought 5 years ago that's now called Apple. It's some other chip that made, some other company that made 64-bit processors. Apple said, hey, we like your style. Here's a bunch of money. Now you're Apple. Now they make their own silicon. That's just business, right? That's replace Apple with any other company that has deep pockets. All right, so in any case, what I just brought up was this idea that when you get the latest greatest Samsung Galaxy, a lot of times it has gadgets and stuff on it that the next iPhone that maybe doesn't come out for 6 months. Look at the cycle. The Galaxy S9s are coming out here probably in a couple of months. They're just now getting ready to announce them. So they're about 6 months ahead of Apple's cycle, right? Now, are there going to be some things on the new Galaxy S9 that even next year's iPhone won't have? Probably. How many of those things are actually useful? So how many of you use Samsung Android phones? Remember those commercials a while ago that had showed a whole bunch of people waiting in line for an iPhone? They would walk up and they had that thing where you can tap the phones together, just swap playlists. Yeah, well, I mean that was the technology it was using, but it specifically was you could swap playlists. How many of you do that? You did it once just to see what it was like, but that whole commercial was about that feature. So a lot of it's gimmicky type stuff, right? So, but in any case, a company like Samsung, there's no risk to them to do something like that because they want to have value add for their end users. Because if you're drinking the Apple Kool-Aid, you already know you're paying a premium, right? You know you're paying top dollar for your device. Well, what does Apple do? Apple looks at all the technologies out right now and says, this is our price point. If you look at iPhones year after year, they come out at the same price point. They just slot a new device in at the same price point it was the year before. Every now and then they'll bump a price by $30, but generally not. Apple says, this is what we can make for that price point with today's parts. Does that make sense? What was the iPhone 10, this new device? Apple said, look, you want all the crap? Fine. We'll put all the crap in here, and this is what it costs. More. Right? That's the iPhone 10. Choose your poison. What do people do? They just complained about the price. But the reality is this phone costs pretty much the same as an iPhone 10. This is Samsung's Note 8. It's $1,000. We're within $50. I mean, at some point, you just stop caring. We just know phones are expensive, right? Then you get on one of the next plans or Apple's upgrade every year plan thing, and it's like a car payment. You pay $55 a month. You got the latest, greatest phone. Next year, the new latest, greatest one comes out. You hand them the phone. They hand you a new one. You keep paying your money.
I don't really get all the
Well, I do. I mean, I'm a technology expert, so I got to have the latest, greatest. It's just part of my lifestyle. So that's $50 a month. I'll just pay to always have the latest thing, right? Just like this guy and his 30 gigabyte internet. 60 gigabyte internet.
Maybe I'm just ahead of everyone else.
You're even ahead of the providers.
He's receiving it at 60.
This is the same guy who's driving a flying car to school. I don't even think the aliens have 30 gigabyte internet or 60 gigabyte internet. They're hanging out in his bag and stealing his Wi-Fi. So now we've gotten to the point. So in the early years of iPhone versus Android, iOS versus Android, and like I said, I've used both of. I've written software for both devices since they came out, for years and years and years and years. I don't care who wins. In fact, from a consumer's perspective, it's in our best interest to have both of them be really, really good. You know, we've seen this in graphics cards the last several years. NVIDIA has had by far the better graphics cards for the last 4 years. ATI was just crap. Even ATI's newest stuff that just came out really has just caught up to NVIDIA's middle-of-the-road graphics cards. That's not good for consumers. We need the war. We want us to have that conversation. Who has the best graphics card? Whichever one came out most recently. That benefits the consumer from a price point perspective and from a technology perspective. Over the last 4 years, what was NVIDIA's motivation to come up with better stuff? If their competitor is crap, they could just keep raising the prices. Well, the crypto miners did that, helped raise the prices. But, you know, in the early days of iOS versus Android, any Android person who said that their device was better than an iOS device was just smoking something. And it's not so much that Android is inherently bad. They're solving a harder problem. Android is solving the old Microsoft problem. Let me kind of get that on a slide here. So that's where we'll connect this and swing back towards the Microsoft Apple thing. Now, how many of you use Microsoft Windows? A lot of us, right? Yeah. Even if you have a Mac, you might have a Windows machine at home, or you dual boot Windows on your Mac, whatever. What's the most popular desktop operating system out there today? Is it Windows or is it the Mac OS?
I think it's still Windows.
It's not even close.
Really?
I don't know what the current number is. Windows had like 98% of the market at some point. Maybe it's still 94. It's not even a close competition. But as consumers, it feels like it's closer than it is, right? Mm-hmm. It's a lot closer when you look at it from a laptop perspective. But there's still more laptops running Windows than running Mac OS. Yeah. But it's at least less embarrassing. Okay, but if you just look across all of computing, it's a war that Microsoft will never lose their lead in. They're ubiquitous with desktop computing, right? But what's happening now is these things are becoming more and more of our daily computing devices. Are we that far, do you think, from having kind of a shell of a laptop? I mean, how many of you have a Chromebook? Okay, you have a Chromebook. Chrome is a laptop built around, Chromebook is a laptop built around the Chrome web browser, which they say is a operating system in and of itself. So it doesn't even run Windows. It tries to do everything using web technologies. And then they keep upgrading it to allow you to do a couple extra things. What's going to end up happening is the world of computing that we see today, desktop computers running Windows, whatever, is going to be supplanted with the next thing. Microsoft isn't going to lose its It's war. You're going to have a shell of a laptop here. You'll bring your phone here, slide it in, and that's now the brains of your laptop.
Do you see the new Razer laptop that you can put your
It already exists. Yeah, some of these things like that exist, but these are special case type tools. That's going to be our future. Or you'll get home to your computer, you'll have your big monitor set up with a keyboard and mouse, and you'll just dock your phone, and that becomes your computing device. Yeah. Well, what drives it today? The size of the screen, right? If you're at home working on something, you'd rather be writing your paper on a bigger screen than on a screen this size.
Mm-hmm.
So it all comes down to powering the screen. We're even seeing it in home entertainment. How many of you have a Nintendo Switch? Okay, you have a Nintendo Switch. So the Switch is a Nintendo console that you play on your TV for a little bit, then you pick it up and you take it with you. How often do you actually play it on the TV?
Every once in a while.
But usually it's like a really, really, really good portable gaming system, right? It's like, hey, that's way better than a Game Boy. Well, you know what I mean? It's like it's way more powerful.
Yeah, but the battery's not.
Yeah, no, I get it. Because it's doing so much more,
Yeah.
right? But that's where things are going. When he wants to play his Switch on the TV, what the decision he's making is, I'm going to plant my butt on the couch for the next 4 hours. I'd like to have a bigger screen. That's the decision you're making. The hardware is the same, whether you're playing it on the TV or playing it somewhere else. And I think that's the direction we're moving. So in any case, Microsoft's not going to lose their lead there. Now, I made this comment that Android is solving the old Microsoft problem. What is that? So most of us said that we are Microsoft Windows users, or that's at least something that is part of our life at some level. Now, does Microsoft make computers? No, they make software. So that means when they wrote Windows, they had to make this thing run on all the zillions of different kinds of computers that are already out there. It's got to run well on a Dell, and on an Asus, replaced with your favorite brand, right? It has to run on all those different machines, with all those different pieces of hardware. Some of them have this graphics card, some of them have that graphics card, some of them have this disk drive, so on and so forth. That's a really, really hard problem Microsoft had to solve. How many of you have heard Apple fanboys say something like, well, my Mac is more stable than Windows, or my Mac is more secure than Windows? We heard some of those statements before. Is a Mac operating system more stable than a Windows operating system? It actually might be. Has very little to do with Apple. I mean, first of all, the current Apple operating system, they stole from OpenBSD. Took it from a Unix-based operating system. It's been around for a long time. It's been tested for forever and ever and ever. They just put a nice fancy front end on it. It makes people feel all gooey inside, right? That's great. Also, if you're one of the jerks who write viruses to attack computers, all right, do you attack the 93% or do you attack the 4%? Yeah, so is it that well, there's Linux and stuff in there too. You get some other operating systems in the room.
Well, I mean,
Yeah. So you have other operating systems, not just Mac, that fills the gap. But in any case, if you're writing these viruses, you're going to target the big guy, Microsoft Windows. No wonder you feel safer with the Mac. Now, could you say that maybe there's less security holes in the Mac? Sure, because there's less security holes in Unix. It's been around for a long time. It's been changed. It's had longer to evolve. But at the end of the day, if Apple was the leader, there would be more viruses. More people would want to attack it. They would look for ways to get back at them. So Microsoft is solving a very difficult problem. They're writing software that has to run on a whole bunch of hardware they don't have any control over. Apple is solving a much easier problem. Their software only has to work great in their own crap. Right? They have 6 or 7 computers that are out. They just say, hey, latest operating system needs to work really well on those. And guess what? We made all of those. They control all aspects of it. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So it becomes kind of an interesting problem. In fact, I'm going to throw a slide in here. Let's call it Apple history so we can hit it next time. Now, when I say Android is solving the Microsoft problem, what we're really talking about is the Android operating system has to run on all these different phones. So, for instance, the latest, greatest Android operating system that's out right now is 8.0, which is Oreo. I think it's 8.0.2 now or whatever. So it's Android Oreo. Now, this is a Note 8, one of the newest, latest, greatest, coolest, blah, 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 Android phones. This is not running Oreo. This runs 7.1.1 or 7.3.1, whatever it is. 7.1.1. Why is that? Well, very few Android phones actually run the native Android operating system because Android's open source. So most phone makers, what they do is they take Android and they Samsung it, or they, LG it, whatever it is. They add some of their own bloatware and stuff to it to make it more like this guy. You have Android Assistant, Google Assistant with this that comes with Android, but then this guy also has this dude called Bixby, which is their own like it even has a button. Bixby has a button over here. You push that button and you talk to this other dude who's supposed to help you schedule crap and stuff like that. Why? Well, they wanted to make Samsung-y version of this stuff. But what that means is when Android Oreo comes out, you can't just immediately slap it on this. You have to wait for Samsung to go through and Samsungify Oreo before it'll go on this device. The only devices right now that are running Oreo are the Pixels. Okay. Because Google controls the hardware. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. They're running native versions of the operating system. I think the heard somebody reference it earlier, the 5. What's the name of that?
The 1+5.
1+5. I think that runs Oreo now as well, because that runs native Android. Does not try to do anything extra with it. But in any case, Android is solving that similar to Microsoft problem, where they're writing an operating system that's meant to run on a whole bunch of different hardware. Where on the Apple side of things, Apple's writing iOS, and what does it have to run well on? iPhones and iPads. Great. Same screen sizes. I mean, for a long time, Apple used to complain about Android, that Android, when they would say Android is too fragmented. You ever seen that quote? When they say Android is too fragmented, what are they talking about? It's kind of related to what we were just saying.
You got everything from Note 8 to a little.
Yeah. At the end of the day, I mean, it really talks about even the technological capabilities, but if we want to just dumb it down, it really talks about just the variance in screen sizes and pixel densities and resolution of all the different Android devices. If you took 100 Android devices and laid them on a table, you probably have something like 30 different screen configurations. So now think about it from a software developer's perspective, which now is our world. If you're writing software for this, how do you target 30 different screen sizes? Right. You have to have tools that allow your interface to kind of like stretch to different size screens. Typically, so my software company for years, we would always write the iPhone. We still do it. We write the iPhone version first. Then we write the Android version. And if you are an Android and an iPhone user, or have been in the past, one thing you've probably noticed is that the iPhone version of an app almost always looks substantially more polished than the Android version of that same app. It's not that Android is garbage. It's that app had to be written to run on 30 different screen sizes. Where, until recently, you only had to have it run on one screen size for iPhone. Now it's more like 4. Yeah. Yeah, if you're, we're going to talk about those languages, but if you're writing Android applications natively, you program in Java using Android Studio. If you're writing, and we use Android Studio in the next class. Swift for iOS, and prior to Swift, it was Objective-C. And we'll talk about those probably this week. We'll get into that. All right, so let's see. Your homework for today was what, 3 and 4?
Yes.
So next one is the next 2 modules. Woo. 4 and 5, and I think there's 8 total modules. So hopefully is there 8 or 10? Whatever it is. Hopefully our timing works, where you get through the modules, at the same time as I get through the history crap, and then we dive into Python.
Okay.
Make sense?
Yeah.
But we will spend some time talking about some of the stuff you're learning in Mendex. I need some runway on my side.
Okay. Yeah, I got it.
All right.
Sweet.